The first time Evelyn Beckett's flower cart went unnoticed by every soul in Dust Creek, Texas. She told herself it was just a slow Tuesday. But by the third week of near starvation and mounting debt, she understood that slow Tuesdays had a way of stretching into slow eternities out on the frontier. It was the spring of 1882, and Dust Creek sat at the edge of Comanche County like a splinter in the heel of a boot, small enough to be forgotten, rough enough to be remembered for all the wrong reasons. The town had grown up fast around a cattle trail and a railroad depot that came and then half left, leaving behind a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, a church that leaned noticeably westward, and a tangle of sun-bleached wooden storefronts that gave the impression of teeth slowly falling out of a dry old mouth. It was not, by any generous accounting, the kind of town where a young woman of 23 years could expect to make a living selling flowers. But Evelyn Beckett had not come to Dust Creek expecting things to be easy. She had come because her mother had died in the winter and left her a small plot of land on the southern edge of town, along with a broken-down wagon, 4 horses who had opinions about everything, a debt of $40 owed to the bank, and a garden that was, despite all the surrounding hardship, absolutely magnificent. Her mother, Clara Beckett, had spent 30 years coaxing flowers out of the hard Texas soil with a patience that bordered on the religious. She had roses climbing the fence posts, lavender in thick rows beside the vegetable patch, wild sunflowers standing like sentinels at the property's edge, and climbing jasmine that had taken over the south wall of the house so thoroughly that in summer the whole place smelled like something out of a dream. When Clara died, she left Evelyn that garden and precious little else, but Evelyn had looked at all those blooms pushing bravely up through the cold February ground and thought, this is something. This has to be something. She had no experience in business. She had been schooled by her mother in the ways of plants, in the reading of soil, in the science of seeds and the art of arrangement. She could take a handful of wildflowers and a sprig of rosemary and make something that looked like it belonged in a church in San Antonio rather than on a rickety cart in a half-forgotten Texas town. Her hands were quick and certain when it came to flowers. It was people she had trouble reading. She set up her cart on the main street of Dust Creek on the first Monday of March. The wagon bed transformed into a sort of mobile garden, buckets of water holding her best specimens, paper cones twisted for individual bouquets, little arrangements nestled in whatever jars and tin cans she had been able to spare from the kitchen. She had dressed as well as she could, her dark hair pinned up neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her dress clean, and pressed though it was beginning to show its age at the hem. She had smiled at everyone who passed. The cowboys had tipped their hats and moved along. The ranchers' wives had paused, admired, and then said they couldn't justify the expense this week, perhaps next week, perhaps in April. The men coming out of the saloon had looked at her arrangement of yellow roses and purple larkspur with the blank incomprehension of people who had never once considered that flowers were a thing one might purchase. The children had tried to steal the sunflowers, which was almost flattering. By the end of the first week, she had sold 6 bouquets and made enough money to buy a modest amount of cornmeal and a piece of salt pork. By the end of the second week, she had sold 4 bouquets and was beginning to do very careful arithmetic in her head each evening when she looked at the flowers that had not sold, knowing they would be wilted and unsellable by tomorrow, and that each unsold bloom represented something she had grown from seed or cutting, water she had carried from the well, hours she had spent on her knees in the garden. It was on a Thursday afternoon of the third week, when Evelyn was calculating with a tight and hollow feeling in her chest how many more weeks she could sustain herself before the bank debt became insurmountable and the property had to go, that she first became aware of the arrangement that would change everything. She had not seen him arrive. That was the thing she would think about later, turning it over and over in her mind like a smooth stone. She had simply not seen him. One moment she was standing behind her cart in the thin afternoon warmth, watching a tumbleweed scratch its way across the far end of the street, and the next moment there was a ranch hand standing in front of her, a lean young man of perhaps 20 with sunburned skin and nervous eyes, holding his hat in both hands. "Ma'am," he said, "I've been sent to buy the remainder of what you have today. All of it, if it please you, all of what you haven't sold." Evelyn blinked at him. "All of it?" "Yes, ma'am. Every last stem and bloom, whatever you've got left at the end of your day." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a leather pouch that made a sound like good news when it landed on the edge of her cart. "That should cover it and then some. My employer says to keep the change for your trouble." Evelyn opened the pouch. There was more money in it than she had seen in the past 3 weeks combined. Her throat went tight in a way that had nothing to do with the dry Texas wind. "Who is your employer?" she asked. The young man's eyes skittered sideways in a way that told her the answer to that question was something he had been specifically instructed to be careful about. "Just a rancher, ma'am. He'd prefer to remain anonymous if it's all the same to you." "A rancher who wants whatever flowers I have left at the end of my day." "Yes, ma'am. And if I ask why, I expect he'd say that's his own business, ma'am. He means no offense. He'd like the flowers." She stared at the ranch hand for a long moment, searching for some explanation in his earnest, uncomfortable face. He offered her nothing except his discomfort. She looked at the pouch, then at her cart, 14 bouquets still unsold, 2 buckets of loose stems, a small arrangement of dried lavender she had put together on a whim. She thought about the debt at the bank. She thought about the cornmeal running low in the kitchen. "Tell your employer I appreciate his custom," she said finally, and began to wrap the flowers. She expected it to happen once. It happened the next Thursday as well, and the Thursday after that, and then the week following. The ranch hand came on a Wednesday because it had rained Thursday and Evelyn had not set up her cart. By the end of April she had paid off nearly a third of her bank debt, and her garden was putting forth its best spring showing in memory, as though the flowers themselves understood they were needed now. She tried, on half a dozen occasions, to find out who the rancher was. The ranch hand, whose name was Tommy. She eventually extracted this much, turned the color of a boiled beet, whenever she pressed him, and said only that his employer valued his privacy, that he was a man of some standing in the county, that he meant no disrespect and in fact spoke very highly of her arrangements, and that Tommy himself would be in considerable trouble if he said any more than that. He was so transparently miserable under her questioning that she eventually stopped pressing, not from lack of curiosity but from pity. She asked around town. She described Tommy to every person willing to listen: the hat he wore, the horse he rode, the specific buckle on his saddle belt, which had an unusual design she had noticed. Old Greta Simmons at the general store squinted and thought about it, and said he sounded like he might be one of the Hunter Ranch hands. But the Hunter Ranch was a serious operation up in the Northwest Hills with 40,000 acres and enough cattle to create their own weather, and she couldn't say for certain. She hadn't seen the Hunter men up close in some time. The Hunter Ranch was famously self-sufficient and famously private. "Eli Hunter," said Greta Simmons, half to herself, in the way one says a name that carries a great deal of weight. "Now there's a name. Took over from his father about 6 years back when the old man had his stroke. Runs that place like a fortress. Doesn't come to town much. Doesn't talk to people much. Big operation. Good cattle. Fair with his men from what I hear." She paused. "Doesn't come to town much," she said again, as if this bore repeating. "What does he look like?" Evelyn asked. Greta Simmons thought about this for a moment that stretched itself out in an unexpectedly complex way. "Tall," she said at last. "Dark, serious-looking. Can't really say more than that. It's been a while, like I said. He was about 25, 26 when his father died. That would make him, 31, 32 now, something like that." She looked at Evelyn with a kind of appraising curiosity that made Evelyn feel her question had revealed more about herself than she intended. "Why do you ask?" "No particular reason," said Evelyn, which was a thing that satisfied neither of them. She did not catch a glimpse of him that week, nor the next. Tommy continued to arrive with the same regularity and the same leather pouch, and Evelyn continued to let him take her unsold flowers, and she told herself she was simply grateful for the business arrangement and not at all preoccupied with the question of who sat behind it. She was lying to herself, and she knew it even as she was doing it. The truth was that the mystery of Eli Hunter had worked its way under her skin in the manner of all truly compelling mysteries. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and persistently, the way water works into the cracks of stone over years and decades. She found herself, in the mornings when she was arranging her cart, thinking about what sort of man bought flowers anonymously and in bulk. Not for any particular woman. Tommy had made it clear in his awkward, halting way that the flowers were not for courting anyone. They were simply, he wanted them. He had the garden at the ranch, a large one, and he liked to have fresh flowers brought in when the ranch's own garden was between seasons, and she was the best flower vendor he had encountered. This last part she held at an angle in her mind and inspected it from multiple directions. He had encountered other flower vendors. He had decided she was the best. He had never once come to look at her flowers himself, never walked past her cart, never made any direct transaction. He had sent Tommy, always with the leather pouch and the same quietly apologetic expression. It was peculiar. It was more than peculiar. It was the sort of thing that kept her awake on clear nights when the stars over Texas were so bright and so cold that they felt almost accusatory, as if the universe were pointing at her and asking what she intended to do about herself. May came in warm and sudden, the way Texas springs sometimes do, leaping from the tentative cool of early spring directly into a heat that meant business. Evelyn's garden hit its peak. The roses were extraordinary that year, great heavy-headed blooms in cream and deep red, and a particular shell pink that had come from a cutting her mother had guarded like a treasure. She made her best arrangements of the year and brought them to town with a feeling that was something close to pride. Her sales improved in May. The ranchers' wives who had said perhaps next week began actually buying, enchanted by the roses. The Reverend's wife bought an arrangement for the church every single week. A cattle buyer passing through on his way to Abilene bought 3 dozen roses at full price without blinking and carried them off in the direction of the hotel, which told a story Evelyn did not pursue. She was beginning to see a real future in this, a genuine possibility that she could make the cart work not just as a bridge across desperate times but as a real livelihood. She had paid off over half the bank debt by the middle of May, and she let herself feel good about that. She had earned it. She had grown every single flower with her own hands in her mother's garden, which was also now hers, and she had arranged them and she had sold them, and she was making her way. She was proud of herself and she was lonely, and she was still thinking about Eli Hunter. Tommy came on the usual day and stood before her cart with the usual leather pouch, and for the first time in a month he found there was very little left. She had sold well that day. "Tell me honestly," Evelyn said, watching Tommy count out what remained, "does your employer actually use these flowers, or is this simply charity?" Tommy's hand stilled on a bundle of larkspur. He looked at her for a moment with that expressive, sun-weathered face, and she saw something complicated cross it, something that wasn't quite discomfort this time, but something closer to sincerity. "He uses them, ma'am," Tommy said. "I can promise you that. He has a large house and the flowers go in the rooms. He pays attention to them. He notices if they've been arranged specially." He paused. "I shouldn't say more than that." "Is he a good man?" she asked. The question surprised her as it came out of her mouth. She hadn't planned to ask it, but she let it stand. Tommy thought about it seriously, which she appreciated. He didn't offer the quick reassurance she might have expected. He turned it over the way a person turns over something with genuine weight to it. "Yes, ma'am," he said at last. "He is. He's hard and he's private and he doesn't make it easy for people to know him. But he's fair. He keeps his word. He'd go without himself before he let one of his men go without. That's the kind of man he is." He picked up the bundle of larkspur again. "That's as much as I can honestly tell you." Evelyn nodded slowly. "That's enough," she said. "For now." What changed the arrangement, what turned it from a quiet business transaction conducted at a distance into something with direct lines and actual physical consequence, was a fire. It started in the livery stable on a dry night at the end of May, and ran through the east side of the street fast as a rumor. By the time the men had formed bucket lines from the water trough, it had taken the livery and the saddlery beside it and put a serious question mark over the general store. Nobody was badly hurt. The horses had been let out in time, which Evelyn would later think was the kind of detail that told you everything about a town's priorities. But the destruction was significant. The east side of Main Street was a charred wreck by morning. Evelyn's cart had been parked on the west side, 2 blocks down, and had been safe. But the chaos of the night had disrupted the following 2 weeks completely. The street was full of debris and the smell of burning. There were no proper places to set up, and the foot traffic that had been her modest but growing customer base was fractured and distracted. She set up as well as she could in the 3rd week after the fire, in a spot a little farther west than usual. Sales were poor. The town was still too busy rebuilding and calculating losses to stop for flowers. She went home that Thursday evening with more unsold blooms than she'd had in weeks, and Tommy had not come. Perhaps the disruption had confused the timing. She sat on her front porch that evening in the long golden light, looking at the flowers she would have to throw away in the morning, and she felt the discouragement settle over her like a familiar, unwelcome garment. She had been doing so well. She had felt the forward motion of something building, something real and possible, and now she felt it stuttering. The remaining bank debt pressed on her like a hand on the back of her neck. She heard the hoofbeats on the road before she saw anything, and she turned to look without much expectation. There were 2 horses. The rider in front was Tommy, recognizable at a considerable distance by his particular way of sitting a horse, and the hat she had catalogued so carefully. The rider behind him was someone else entirely. He was large, even on horseback, broad through the shoulders in the way that comes from genuine physical work rather than the artificial thickness of someone merely well-fed. He rode with the unconscious confidence of a man who had been on a horse since before he could properly walk, relaxed and upright at the same time, one hand easy on the reins. She could see, even at this distance, that he was wearing a coat that had seen real use, a hat pulled low against the slanting evening light, and that he sat very still in the saddle in the manner of a man who was accustomed to taking in a landscape before deciding what to do with it. They came up the road to her fence and stopped. Tommy swung down and she rose from her chair and walked toward the gate, her heart doing something irregular that she decided to attribute to the surprise of unexpected visitors. "Miss Beckett," Tommy said, and there was something in his voice, a formality that was slightly more charged than his usual manner. "This is Mr. Hunter, Mr. Eli Hunter." The man on the horse shifted and looked at her, and for the first time in 2 months she saw the face of the man who had been buying her flowers every week. He was, in fact, exactly as Greta Simmons had cryptically suggested, tall, dark, serious. He had a face that had been shaped by years of outdoor work and private thought, a strong jaw, weathered brown by the sun, a mouth that looked like it took its time before deciding to speak, and eyes that were the particular deep brown of good soil, steady and direct and somewhat startling in their intensity. There were lines at the corners of those eyes that came from sun and wind and perhaps from squinting at horizons and calculating what they meant. He could not have been described as pretty, but he was striking in a way that went beyond simple physical description, the way certain landscapes are striking, not because every element is perfect, but because they all combine into something that compels attention. He was looking at her with an expression that was not quite what she expected. She had built a mental portrait of a gruff, solitary, possibly eccentric older man with an odd attachment to flowers. The man before her was none of those things, or rather he was one of them. The serious, solitary part was clearly accurate, but the overall effect was not of an eccentric. It was of a man who had very deliberately kept himself at a careful distance from the world and was now, for some reason she did not yet understand, choosing not to do that. "Miss Beckett," he said. His voice was low and measured, with the slight roughness of someone who spent more time outdoors than in conversation. "I heard about the fire and the disruption to your business. I apologize for not sending Tommy sooner. I should have sent him when the fire happened, not waited for the regular schedule." She blinked. He apologized easily, this rancher who had apparently spent 2 months arranging never to be seen. He apologized with the naturalness of a man who considered it simple good manners to acknowledge where he'd fallen short. "I appreciate that," she said. "But there was no obligation, Mr. Hunter. You've been extraordinarily generous already." His brow moved in a way that might, in a more expressive face, have been a frown. "It wasn't generosity," he said. "It was a straightforward business transaction. I wanted the flowers. You were selling them. You were consistently paying more than they were worth. I was paying what they were worth to me," he said. "That's how commerce works, generally." There was a silence that felt charged in an interesting way. She was still standing at her gate and he was still on his horse, and the evening light was doing something golden and dramatic to everything it touched, the way Texas evenings sometimes did. "Would you like to come in?" she asked. It surprised her again, the way her own words sometimes did. "I have more flowers than I can use and less coffee than I should have, but I do have coffee." He looked at her for a moment. She had the distinct impression that he was weighing something, that the question she had asked was not quite as simple as the words made it seem, and that he understood this. "I would," he said. He dismounted with the ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times, handed the reins to Tommy with a brief word, and followed her through the gate. She showed him around the garden as the coffee brewed on the stove inside, and this was where she understood something important about Eli Hunter, something that the weeks of anonymous transactions had not been able to tell her. He walked through her mother's garden with the attentiveness of someone who genuinely, profoundly loved flowers. He paused at the roses. He leaned down to smell the lavender with a naturalness that had nothing performative about it. He stopped before a late-blooming iris of a deep purple that had been Clara Beckett's particular pride, and looked at it for a moment with something on his face that Evelyn could only describe as recognition, the way you look at something beautiful when you haven't seen it in a long time. "Your mother grew all of this?" he asked. "And her mother before her, partially. The irises were from cuttings she brought all the way from Tennessee in a bucket of wet soil. She said the soil itself came with them, that you can't separate a plant from where it comes from." He looked at her, and there was something in his expression now that had shifted slightly from the careful assessment of the man at the gate. "She sounds like she was remarkable." She was. Evelyn said it simply and absolutely, the way you say things when they are so true they don't need embellishment. They sat on the porch with their coffee and talked for an hour. She would not have predicted this. She would have said, in all her weeks of imagining this meeting, that the mysterious rancher would be awkward in person, that the anonymity had been a shield against social difficulty. But Eli Hunter was not awkward. He was quiet, certainly, and he was not the kind of man who filled silences for the sake of filling them. But when he spoke, he was direct and thoughtful and occasionally dry in a way that made her laugh when she wasn't expecting to. He told her about his ranch with a spare, understated pride that she found enormously appealing. The way he talked about his cattle and his land and his men as things that were his responsibility, not his possessions. She asked him why he had started sending Tommy for the flowers, and he was quiet for a moment before he answered. "My mother had a garden," he said. "Not as good as this one, but she cared about it the way your mother cared about this one. She died 4 years ago. The garden at the ranch has been maintained, but it's not the same. When I heard there was a woman selling flowers in town, I thought—" He stopped, and she saw something very briefly on his face that he then put away again with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to keeping his own counsel. "I thought it would be good to have flowers in the house again. But I didn't." He paused again, and the pause had a different quality this time, less controlled. "I hadn't been to town in some time. I preferred the arrangement I proposed. It seemed simpler." "Simpler than what?" she asked. "Simpler than coming to town and talking to people," he said, and the honesty of it was so matter-of-fact that she had to work not to smile too broadly. "I find that somewhat encouraging," she said, "given that you are currently on my porch talking to me." He looked at her again with those direct brown eyes, and the very faint possibility of something that might have been a smile crossed his serious face. "You are considerably harder to keep at a distance than most people," he said. "That is not a complaint." She went to town the next morning with a smile she hadn't entirely planned on. The subsequent weeks unfolded with a quality she would have struggled to articulate at the time, but which she understood in hindsight as the quality of something inevitable revealing itself at its own deliberate pace. Eli Hunter came to town twice more in June, stopping to speak with her each time, brief conversations that had the same quality as everything he did, concentrated and genuine. He did not make flowery declarations. He did not perform any of the pantomimes of courtship she had watched other men perform around other women. He simply showed up and was interested in what she had to say and said things worth hearing back to her, and each time he left she spent the rest of the day turning the conversation over in her mind. He was, she discovered in these increments, a man of startling depth beneath the gruff, contained exterior. He had read widely, especially history and natural science, with the self-taught thoroughness of someone who had pursued knowledge for its own sake rather than for display. He had opinions about the management of grassland that he held with the same steady intensity he seemed to bring to everything. He had a younger brother who had gone to study law in Austin, and with whom he corresponded regularly, and about whom he spoke with a cautious, private pride. He had a ranch foreman named George Beaumont who had been with the Hunter family for 20 years, and whom Eli spoke of with the kind of quiet loyalty that told her something important about how he kept his commitments. She also discovered, in the way you discover things about people you are watching closely, that Eli Hunter carried something. Not in any dramatic or visible way. He did not wear his grief or his solitude the way some lonely men wear it, like a costume meant to be noticed. But it was there, in the particular way he sometimes looked at the horizon when a conversation touched on certain things, in the way he had said his mother died 4 years ago with a flatness that was the opposite of indifference, in the fact that a man of 32 with a 40,000-acre ranch and the means and build to attract attention had apparently spent the last several years deliberately avoiding it. She did not press. She was not, by nature, a woman who pressed. But she paid attention, and she let him find his own way toward her at whatever pace felt true to him. In July, Tommy arrived without the leather pouch and with a folded piece of paper instead, and Evelyn's heart did its irregular thing again before she told it firmly to be quiet. The note was brief and written in a hand that was blunt and sure, no unnecessary curls or flourishes, black ink pressed firmly into the page. "Miss Beckett, I have a summer dinner in 10 days for the ranchers in this district, which I hold each year out of obligation and have never particularly enjoyed. I would consider it a significant improvement to the occasion if you would attend as my guest. The dinner is the 14th. If this interests you, send back with Tommy. If it does not, I will understand and the current arrangement can continue unchanged. E. Hunter." She read it twice. She read it a third time with the particular attention one gives to things that matter. She noted the directness of it, the total absence of false modesty or performative casualness, the acknowledgement that she might say no and the genuine okayness with that. She noted the words significant improvement, which in Eli Hunter's economy of expression she suspected carried the weight of something a more demonstrative man might express at considerably greater length. She borrowed Tommy's pencil and wrote on the back of the note, "I'll come. E. Beckett." She handed it back to Tommy, who permitted himself a small, relieved smile that told her he had been somewhat invested in this outcome. The 14th of July was a Saturday, and Evelyn spent the morning trying not to be foolish about getting ready and failing. She wore her best dress, which was a deep blue cotton that her mother had said brought out the gray in her eyes, and she pinned her hair up with more care than usual and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and thought, "This is a person who has been making a living selling flowers in a hard town and paying off a dead woman's debts and doing something real." She was allowed to look nice for a dinner. Eli Hunter arrived himself to collect her, which she had not expected. He rode up to her gate at 4:30 in the long summer light, looking like something from a different story than the one she had been living, clean-shaven for the occasion. His coat a good dark wool. His hat a better one than the field hat she had seen him in before. He looked, she thought, like what he was, a man of substance and capability who had grown very comfortable in his own skin and was not particularly interested in performing for anyone but had nonetheless made an effort. He looked at her when she came through the gate, and whatever he saw produced a brief but genuine alteration in his expression, a kind of arrested attention, quickly controlled, that she filed away carefully. "You look very well," he said. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." He helped her onto the horse he had brought for her with a practical efficiency, and then they rode the 12 miles to the Hunter ranch in the long golden evening, talking some and being quiet some, and both felt equally comfortable. The land around the Hunter property was extraordinary rolling hills gone golden with summer grass. Cattle dotted across the distance in the unhurried way of cattle that have enough to eat and enough room. And then the ranch itself coming into view around a long curve of the road, large and well built, and surrounded by the kind of established trees that told you it had been there a generation. The summer dinner was exactly as he had described, an obligation attended by 12 of the major ranching families of Comanche County, people with names she recognized from town and from the conversations of others. They were curious about her. She could feel it plainly, the polite but sharp attention of people who had known Eli Hunter for years and had never once seen him bring a woman to anything. She was inspected and assessed with varying degrees of subtlety, and she met all of it with the steady cordiality she had developed selling flowers to strangers, and found that it served her well here too. He stayed close to her through the evening, not in an obvious or proprietary way, but in the manner of a man who was quietly making it clear that she was here with him. He introduced her to people he clearly respected and steered her around people he clearly didn't without making a production of it. When a particularly overbearing rancher named Coulter made a comment about flower selling being a fine hobby for a young woman, Eli said, in his quiet, exact voice, that he believed Miss Beckett's operation was rather more than a hobby, given that she had reclaimed her property from significant debt in less than a year, and showed every sign of expanding her enterprise, and Coulter had no useful response to this. She looked at Eli after Coulter moved away and found him already looking at her, and the particular quality of that shared look, the small, contained satisfaction in it, felt more intimate than anything she had expected from a formal dinner. It was after midnight when the last guests left, and she found herself standing on the wide front porch of the Hunter ranch house in the summer dark with the sounds of the night around her, and the ranch hands putting away horses in the distance. Eli stood beside her with a cup of coffee that had been refilled several times in the course of a long evening, looking out at the land. "Did you enjoy yourself?" he asked. "More than I expected to," she said honestly. "You were gracious with people who didn't entirely deserve it, Coulter. Among others," he looked at her sideways. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for asking." She paused. "Though I notice you buried the invitation somewhat under an extensive description of your own lack of enthusiasm for the event," the faint not quite smile. "I wanted you to have accurate information. And did you enjoy it, I mean, more than usual?" He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark hills. "Yes," he said simply, "considerably more." They stood there in the warm July dark for a while longer, not speaking, and it was one of those silences that is not empty but full of things beginning. He brought her home. At her gate, he dismounted and helped her down and held her hand perhaps one moment longer than was strictly necessary before releasing it, and looked at her in the darkness with those steady brown eyes. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if that is acceptable to you." Evelyn looked at him, at this serious, private, complicated man who had bought every flower she couldn't sell for months before he ever let her see his face, who kept his grief quiet and his word absolutely, who had defended her to a dismissive rancher without being asked, who had spent the evening staying close to her in a room full of people, as naturally as if it were simply where he belonged. "It is very acceptable," she said. He called on her the following Saturday, and the one after that, and every Saturday in August. He came for Sunday dinners. He helped her mend a section of her fence that had developed a tilt without being asked, and she fed him apple pie afterward, and they sat on the porch until the stars came out. He showed her around the Hunter Ranch on a warm August afternoon, walking her through the barns and the kitchen garden and the long paddocks, and she saw how his men looked at him with a respect that had nothing servile in it, the respect you give someone who has earned it straight. Old George Beaumont, the foreman, looked at her in a way that told her he had been watching Eli Hunter for 20 years and was privately, profoundly glad to see him bringing a woman to walk in the grass beside him. She told him about her mother. Not all of it at once, but in the incremental way she had learned to trust, and he received each piece of it with the attentiveness of someone who understood that what a person tells you about their grief is one of the most significant things they can offer you. He told her about his own father, the older Hunter, a hard and brilliant man who had built the ranch from almost nothing and left his son a legacy of high standards and very few outward expressions of affection, and who had died of a stroke when Eli was 26, and left him the whole weight of the place with a directness that had not left much room for feeling the grief. He said this last part carefully, the way you say things you haven't said often. In September, the cottonwoods along the creek that ran through the southern end of Evelyn's property turned gold, and she cut some branches and brought them inside and put them in the same tin cans she used for flower arrangements. And when Eli came to dinner on Saturday and saw them, he stopped in the doorway of her kitchen with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something unguarded and moved, quickly absorbed back into his habitual composure, but she had seen it. "Those are beautiful," he said. "The cottonwood season is short," she said. "I like to bring it in while I can." He looked at her across the kitchen in the lamplight, and in the look was everything that had been accumulating between them for months, every flower bought and every porch conversation and every shared silence and every moment of his steady attention and her steady attention back to him. "Evelyn," he said, her given name, which he had been using for 2 months now with a particular directness that she liked. "Yes." He crossed the kitchen in 2 unhurried strides and took both her hands in his, and she looked up at him in the warm lamplight with the autumn cottonwood branches bright on the sideboard in her heart, in a state of absolutely no uncertainty whatsoever. "I should tell you directly," he said, "because I don't see the value in not being direct that I am in love with you. I have been for some time, since before I had the courage to come and let you see me." The corners of his eyes showed that quiet honesty she had come to love. "I am not an easy man. I am private and I am set in my ways, and I will sometimes go too long without talking about things that matter. I am asking you to consider whether that is something you can bear alongside whatever else I might offer." She looked at his hands around hers, the roughness of them, the sureness, the warmth, and then up at his face, that serious, weathered, remarkable face, and she thought of every morning she had arranged flowers for a cart in a hard town, and every evening she had come home to a house that had only her in it, and she thought of his voice saying considerably more than I expected, and she thought of the way he had leaned down to smell the lavender in her mother's garden with no self-consciousness at all. "Eli," she said, with a clarity she felt in her whole body, I have been in love with you since Tommy told me you paid attention to whether the flowers had been specially arranged. I thought then that I was being foolish and that you were probably 60 years old and peculiar." She felt him laugh, which was a sensation, that laugh, because he did it rarely and she felt it through his hands. "You are considerably better than I imagined, and I am considerably more certain than I expected to be. Yes, to whatever you are asking." He kissed her in her kitchen in the cottonwood light, carefully and then not carefully at all, and it was the kind of kiss that settles things. They were engaged by October, and the news ran through Dust Creek with the velocity of all good news in small towns, slightly ahead of the facts and improved upon in the telling. The general consensus, expressed with various degrees of tact by various people, was that it was about time Eli Hunter came out of his fortress, and that Evelyn Beckett was clearly extraordinary to have accomplished it. And these two assessments were not wrong. Her friend Nell Dawson, who ran the laundry on the east side of town, and was the closest thing Evelyn had to a sister in Dust Creek, said finally, with such emphasis that Evelyn laughed until she had to sit down. Greta Simmons at the general store put her hands on Evelyn's and said she was glad, truly glad, and that Clara Beckett would have approved, and this made Evelyn's eyes sting in a way she didn't fight. The reverend who had been buying flowers for the church every week beamed with the satisfaction of a man who takes personal credit for the proximity of two people, despite having had nothing whatsoever to do with it. There were complications, because life in the real world produces complications as reliably as Texas produces dust. The question of the Beckett property was one Evelyn had spent most of the year working to keep it, paying down a debt that was nearly gone now but had cost her everything she had. The garden was there, Clara Beckett's garden, 30 years of devoted labor in the Texas soil. Eli understood this without being told. When she said she would not simply abandon the property, that the garden mattered, that it was her mother's work and her own, he looked at her with that directness of his and said that she would keep the property and the garden, that Tommy could manage it along with the other land matters he handled, that she could sell her flowers from the cart until she wanted to stop or from the ranch itself if she preferred, and that this was not up for discussion because it was obviously the right thing. She wanted to marry him immediately, which surprised her. She was not a woman who had spent her life dreaming of wedding arrangements. But she wanted to be in the same house as Eli Hunter, in his particular solitary warmth, and she did not see the value in prolonging what was already decided. They were married in November by the westward-leaning church, which had been somewhat repaired since the spring and leaned slightly less, though the congregation still sat at an angle that demanded periodic readjustment. Nell Dawson stood up with her. George Beaumont stood up with Eli. Eli's younger brother James had ridden up from Austin and stood beside George looking sharp in his lawyer's suit, and regarding his older brother with an expression of deep, only partially concealed emotion that he had clearly been trained his whole life not to display, and was fighting now with mixed results. The flowers at the church were extraordinary, which went without saying. Evelyn had arranged them herself, the last great autumn blooms from her mother's garden, late roses and chrysanthemums and dried lavender, and the cottonwood branches she had been keeping dried and golden since September. The church smelled, improbably and beautifully, like a garden in November. Eli Hunter, standing at the front of the church in his best clothes, watching her walk toward him, had an expression on his face that she would keep for the rest of her life in the front room of her memory, the place where you keep the things you never want to stop seeing. It was not what she would have called a soft expression. It was not the melted, sentimental expression of a man performing emotion. It was something far more powerful than that, a total, unconditional certainty, the look of a man who has found what he was looking for and knows it. She reached him and he took her hand, and it was warm and sure, and she thought, there is exactly where that belongs. The first year of their marriage was the year she learned all the dimensions of the man she had married, the private geography of who he was in the everyday texture of shared life, and she found it larger and more interesting than she had imagined, which was saying something because she had imagined it extensively. She moved into the Hunter Ranch house, which was large and well-built and somewhat in need of a woman's eye for things like curtains and where the light was good in the morning. She brought her arrangements through its rooms, and he watched her do it with the same quiet attention he brought to everything she did. And after the first month, the ranch house smelled like flowers and coffee and something that had not been there before, which was the specific domestic warmth of a place where two people who love each other live together. She kept the Beckett property and continued her flower cart. Tommy managed the property with the cheerful efficiency of a man who had, Evelyn suspected, developed a personal investment in the success of the arrangement long before any of them knew where it was going. On the days she took the cart to town, Eli often rode part of the way with her, and she would see him stop at the top of the hill and watch her go the rest of the way with an expression that she had come to understand meant, "I am aware that you are entirely capable of doing this yourself, and I am watching anyway because I choose to." In the spring of their first married year, an injustice that had been quietly grinding away in the background of the county came to a public head in a way that could no longer be ignored. The question of water rights to the creek that ran through the southern properties was one that had been nominally settled years before in favor of the larger northern ranches, but the actual reality of water access for the smaller farmers and the Mexican families who had been working small operations in the county for generations was becoming dire as the dry months stretched. Two families, the Garcias and the Romero family, who had farmed the same land for decades, were being effectively cut off from water access by a combination of legal maneuvering and physical intimidation from Coulter's operation, which had expanded aggressively, and whose foreman had taken to making the kind of strongly implied threats that stopped just short of being actionable. Evelyn became aware of this through Rosa Garcia, who came to buy flowers from her one week at the cart, and who looked exhausted and frightened in a way that went beyond ordinary tiredness. She drew the story out of Rosa over the course of several visits, and then she brought it to Eli. He listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he was quiet for a moment that she recognized as the moment when he was deciding something with his full weight behind it. "I know the Garcias' operation," he said, "and the Romeros. They've been good neighbors and they've worked that land fair. Coulter has been pushing the boundaries of what's legal for 2 years. He paused. "I have some standing in this county. I have not used it as much as I should have. I am going to use it now." He wrote to his brother James in Austin. He met with George Beaumont and several of the other ranching families, not Coulter, not the men who had been complicit, but the ones who he knew had privately felt the same discomfort he had about the direction things were going. He made it clear, in the quiet, non-negotiable way he had of making things clear, that the water rights situation was going to be revisited, and that the harassment of the Garcia and Romero families was going to stop. Coulter pushed back. Coulter said things at the next county meeting that were designed to provoke a confrontation. Eli attended the county meeting, sat very still through all of it, and then spoke with the flat precision of a man who has prepared and knows exactly what he's going to say, laying out the legal and practical case against what Coulter had been doing with a clarity that James, sitting beside him, later said was the best impromptu legal argument he had heard outside a courtroom. The water rights were renegotiated. The Garcia and Romero families kept their access. Coulter backed down in the way that bullies back down when they discover that the person they have been ignoring is considerably more formidable than expected, with ill grace and obvious resentment. He left Evelyn and Eli alone after that, which they counted as a reasonable outcome. Rosa Garcia brought flowers to Evelyn's cart the following week, flowers she had grown herself, a variety of marigold that was spectacular, a deep orange that blazed in the September sun. She pressed them into Evelyn's hands with a feeling Evelyn understood completely, the dignity of giving rather than only receiving, the importance of that exchange. Evelyn put Rose's marigolds in the very best position on the cart that day. Their first child was born in the second year of their marriage, in the early morning of a February that was cold but not cruelly so. A boy, large and red-faced and loudly opinionated about his situation from the first moment, who Eli held in the hospital room in the manner of a man who has spent his whole life being competent at large and demanding things, and has now encountered something that reduces all of it to irrelevance. He looked down at his son with an expression that was new, something Evelyn had never seen on his face, something that took his habitual serious attentiveness and added to it a quality of total, undefended vulnerability. He looked in that moment very young and very certain and completely undone. "Thomas," Eli said. It had been decided. Thomas Beckett Hunter, the Beckett for her mother, the Thomas for Tommy, which Tommy himself had been told and which had rendered him incapable of speech for several minutes. "Hello, Thomas," Evelyn said softly, looking at the small red face of her son in his father's arms. Eli looked up at her over the baby's head with those deep brown eyes full of everything he was, and she thought of flowers bought in secret and porch conversations and cottonwood branches and a kiss in the lamplight, and she thought, this is the full shape of it. This is what all of it was building toward. The ranch took on a new quality in the years that followed. It was not that it had been cold before. Eli had always been a warm man, in his particular contained way, but something loosened in him with Evelyn in the house, and then with Thomas, and then 2 years later with their daughter Margaret, who arrived in a rush of personality and proceeded to rearrange the household around herself with the efficiency of a general. The men on the ranch felt it. George Beaumont, who had watched the Hunter ranch through the hard, silent years after Eli's mother died, said to Tommy one evening after a long day of work that the place felt like itself again, and Tommy nodded without needing any further explanation. Evelyn's flower business continued to grow. What had started as desperation had become, over the years, a real enterprise. She had expanded her garden on the Beckett property, added 2 new beds of specialty varieties she had ordered from a grower in San Antonio, and was selling not just from the cart but supplying arrangements to the hotel in the next town, and to a general merchant in Abilene who had approached her after seeing her work at a county fair. She kept the cart too, not because she needed to any more but because she loved it, the early morning setup, the conversations with people who stopped, the way a well-made bouquet could change the expression on someone's face. She hired Rosa Garcia's eldest daughter Maria to help her 2 days a week, and Maria turned out to have her grandmother's gift with flowers in her hands, quick, imaginative, absolutely certain. Evelyn taught her everything she knew, which was a thing her own mother had done for her, and felt the rightness of that chain of transmission, that knowledge passed from hands to hands across time. Thomas grew into a boy of enormous energy, and an outdoor nature that made his father quietly satisfied in the way that people are when they see their own essential character renewed in a new form. He was on a horse by the time he was 4, which Eli had been as well, and had opinions about cattle by the time he was 6 that old George Beaumont said were not entirely wrong, which was the highest praise George Beaumont was known to bestow. Margaret was a different creature, entirely sharp and verbal and interested in everything, with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady, assessing eyes and a combination of both their particular forcefulness that occasionally made Evelyn look at Eli across the dinner table with an expression that said, "We made that," and she could see him working not to smile. James Hunter rode up from Austin for holidays and occasionally for longer visits, and he and Evelyn developed a friendship she valued deeply. He was quick and funny, where his brother was measured and quiet, and he adored his niece and nephew with a complete lack of the reserve that characterized his relationship with most of the world, which told her something important and tender about the Hunter family's capacity for love when they felt safe enough to show it. In the 5th year of their marriage, In late April, when the Beckett garden was doing what it had always done, performing miracles in the hard Texas soil, with a consistency that still sometimes stopped her breath, Evelyn set up her cart on the main street of Dust Creek on a Tuesday morning and looked at it. The buckets of late spring roses, the sweet-smelling stalks, the lavender coming in early this year, the arrangement she had made that morning out of the same shell-pink roses that came from her mother's cutting, arranged in a way she knew her mother would have recognized. She looked at the cart and thought about the first Tuesday she had ever stood behind it, 4 years ago, and the hollow feeling of the third week when everything she had grown was going to be thrown away unappreciated. And the afternoon Tommy had first appeared with his hat in his hands and a leather pouch that changed everything. A woman about her age stopped at the cart and stood looking at the roses with the expression of someone who needed something beautiful and was startled to find it here on a Tuesday morning. She was travel-worn and carrying a bag, and she had the look of someone who had come a long way on not enough sleep. "How much for these?" she asked, pointing to the shell-pink roses. "For you," Evelyn said. "The first bouquet is a welcome to Dust Creek." The woman looked at her. Her eyes were tired, but the tiredness covered something else, something that just needed a minute to show itself. "That's very kind. My mother grew them from a cutting she carried from Tennessee," Evelyn said, wrapping them. "She believed that nothing good comes to you unless you carry it yourself, and nothing you carry is wasted." The woman took the flowers. She looked at them for a moment, and the tired eyes did something. "Thank you," she said. "I mean it." "I know you do," said Evelyn. She watched the woman walk down the sun-bleached street of Dust Creek with the shell-pink roses held against her like something precious. And she felt, in the morning warmth, the full completed shape of a life that had grown from a garden and a desperate Tuesday and a mysterious rancher who had never once let her see his face until she understood exactly why she needed to. Eli came to meet her at the end of the day. He did this sometimes, rode in on a Wednesday evening when the cattle didn't need him, tied up his horse, and waited for her. She had never asked him to. He had never explained it beyond saying he liked the ride. She had long since accepted that this was one of the ways Eli Hunter told her what he felt, in actions rather than articulation, showing up when he didn't have to. He was leaning against the post at the end of her usual spot when she came around with the empty cart, and she stopped for a moment to look at him before he noticed her, the way she still sometimes did, taking a private second to look at him fully without any of the ordinary busyness of daily life in the way. He was watching the street with the distant, considering expression he sometimes got when he was thinking about something real, and the evening light was on him the way it was always on everything here, that particular Texas gold that made you understand why painters had always been chasing it. He turned and saw her, and the considering expression changed to the particular expression she had been watching evolve for years, the one that was Eli Hunter's version of everything, quiet and sure and full of something that started as surprise and had become absolute certainty. "Good day?" he asked. "A good day," she said. "The roses sold particularly well. They always do." He took the cart from her and she walked beside him toward where the horses were hitched, and he said, "Thomas wants to come to market day next week. He says he wants to help you sell flowers." "Does he?" He may have said selling flowers sounded more interesting than moving cattle. "What did you say?" Eli's voice was perfectly level. "I said he might have a point." She laughed, and he looked at her with that look, and then they were riding home in the long gold evening, the road they had ridden dozens of times, past the hills and the running cattle and the established trees of the ranch, where George Beaumont would be finishing the day's work, and Tommy would be making notes in the careful ledger he kept, and where Margaret would have decided that dinner was taking too long and begun negotiations about the matter, and where Thomas would have been outdoors until called in and would come in with grass stains and no apologies, and where James might or might not be visiting on his way back from Austin, and where the ranch house would smell of flowers and wood smoke and the particular domestic richness of a place that was genuinely lived in. The late summer of the 6th year brought a drought that tested the whole county. It was not the worst drought in the history of Comanche County, that had come in 1867 and was still spoken of by those old enough to remember it with a kind of reverent dread, but it was serious enough to require care. The creek dropped. The grass on the lower pastures went brown earlier than usual. Eli managed it with the careful attention that characterized everything he did. He had been watching the weather signs since April and had made decisions about water reserves and cattle movement that the summer proved wise. The Beckett garden was harder hit, and this pained Evelyn in a way that was both practical and personal. But the deep roots her mother had laid over 30 years were not easily broken, and she managed the water carefully and lost fewer plants than she feared she might. She spent several evenings during the drought sitting on the porch of the ranch house with Eli, watching the sky for the cloud formations that might mean rain and talking in the easy, thorough way they had developed over years of conversation. The way two people talk when they have learned each other well enough to say the half-finished thought and trust that it will be understood. "What would you have done," she asked one evening, "if I had said no to dinner that July?" He looked at the sky for a moment, sent Tommy with the leather pouch and tried not to think about it. "And how long would you have kept sending Tommy?" He thought about this with genuine honesty. "I don't know," he said. "A long time, probably. I was very good at not doing things." "You were," she agreed, "until you weren't." "Until I heard about the fire and I thought," he paused, and the honesty in this pause was characteristic, the kind that came from a man who did not avoid difficult self-knowledge. "I thought if I didn't go and see about you myself, I would very much regret it. And I have very few regrets. I intended to keep it that way." She looked at him in the blue evening with the dry hills dark against the last light. She had spent the afternoon in the Beckett garden, coaxing water into the roots of her mother's roses, and she had dirt on her hands still, and her hair had escaped its pins in 3 places, and she thought she had never in her life been more herself than she was right now on this porch in this drought year with this man. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I'm glad Tommy had that saddle buckle that Greta Simmons almost recognized. I'm glad my mother grew irises in Tennessee soil." She paused. "I'm glad for all of it." He put his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him, and they sat there while the sky darkened and the first stars came out over Texas, bright and cold and impossibly numerous, the same stars that had looked down on every difficult thing and every beautiful thing that had happened in this country for longer than there had been people to wonder about them. It rained in September. A real rain, 3 days of it, steady and generous, the kind that soaks deep and stays. The creek came up. The grass began its recovery, in the patient way grass does, not overnight but with a gathering certainty. The Beckett garden drank itself back to health, and by October was showing the late-season tenacity of plants with very deep roots. On the first market day after the drought broke, Evelyn brought a cart so full of flowers that she had to ask Tommy to help her carry the buckets. The town came out for it. People who had been ground down by the long dry summer seemed to want, very specifically, the extravagance of flowers, the unnecessary beautiful thing, the proof that the land was recovered and generous again. She sold everything, every last stem, every arrangement, every individual bloom. She stood at the empty cart in the golden October afternoon and looked at it and felt a satisfaction so complete it was almost physical. Thomas, who had come to help as promised and had turned out to be genuinely useful in the manner of a 7-year-old boy who is determined to demonstrate his competence, stood beside her and regarded the empty cart with the same expression. "We sold everything," he announced, with the emphasis of someone recording a historic event. "We did," she said. "Can we do it again next week?" "Every week," she said. Thomas considered this. "Papa said you never have anything left," he said. "He said a man used to come and take whatever was left, and that's what started everything." She looked at her son, at his father's serious eyes and her own dark hair, at the particular combination of two people that produces something entirely its own. "That's right," she said. "Why didn't he just come himself?" She thought about Eli Hunter in the hills of Comanche County with his 40,000 acres and his private grief, and his extraordinary undemonstrative love for flowers, and the careful distance he had maintained from the world until one autumn evening when he decided not to maintain it anymore. He needed a little time, she said. He got there. Thomas accepted this with the philosophical practicality of a child who has grown up around people who say the true thing. "Okay," he said, and began helping her with the empty buckets. They rode home through the recovered land in the late afternoon, the drought's damage being quietly undone around them, and Evelyn thought about all the things that had led from a desperate Tuesday to this golden October. The debt, and the empty cart, and the leather pouch, and the long nights of arithmetic, and the man who had stood in her mother's garden, and smelled the lavender without self-consciousness, and kissed her in the cottonwood light, and stood at the front of a westward-leaning church with certainty in his eyes. The Hunter Ranch house was warm when they arrived, wood smoke already rising from the chimney, and Margaret came out the front door at the sound of the horses in the manner of a 5-year-old who considers any arrival at the house to be an event requiring her personal attention. She was wearing her everyday dress and had clearly been helping Rose's daughter Maria in the kitchen, because she had flour on her cheek and the expression of someone who has been doing important work. "We sold everything," Thomas told her, dismounting with the authority of someone returning from a significant enterprise. Margaret looked at him with her father's eyes and said, "I know. Papa said you would." Evelyn looked up at the ranch house, at the lit windows and the warmth and the flowers she had put in the front room last week still visible through the glass. She looked at her children and at the established trees, and at the road that ran from this place all the way to Dusk Creek in her mother's garden, and she thought of Clara Beckett on her knees in the Tennessee soil, coaxing irises into a bucket of earth to carry them into an unknown future. Nothing you carry is wasted. Eli came out onto the porch then, having heard the horses, and stood in the lamplight looking out at her with that expression, the one that had never changed in all the years, the one that was certainty and warmth and the particular private abundance of a man who had finally let himself have what he wanted. She swung down from her horse and walked through the late October dusk toward him, and he came down the steps to meet her, and she thought, Here is where I have been going all along." "Everything's sold," she said when she reached him. "I knew it would," he said, which was very Eli Hunter, and she loved him completely for it. He put his arms around her there in the yard with the children behind her and the horses blowing in the cool air and the stars beginning their night work overhead, and she pressed her face into the warmth of his shoulder and felt, with a clarity that required no dramatic announcement and no embellishment, that this was the full shape of a life, not the one she had planned, which had been smaller and harder and had smelled exclusively of worry, but the one that had grown up out of the garden and the cart and the mysterious weekly kindness of a man who had loved beautiful things from a careful distance, and then, when it mattered, chosen to stop being careful. The winter that year was mild and long and full. James came up from Austin for Christmas and stayed 3 weeks, longer than usual, and there were days when the ranch house had a noise and warmth to it that made even old George Beaumont come in for more meals than strictly necessary, sitting at the long kitchen table with his coffee, and listening to the children, and the conversation with the expression of a man who is profoundly content to be inside a particular kind of life. Thomas learned, that winter, how to read to his sister from a book of natural history that James brought him from Austin, sitting by the fire with Margaret leaning against him, and both of them very serious about the enterprise. Eli watched this from across the room one evening with the same unguarded look he had first shown holding Thomas in the hospital, that total, vulnerable certainty, and Evelyn, from her chair across the fire, caught his eye, and they looked at each other in the firelight the way people look at each other when they are both thinking the same thing, and the same thing is simply this. In the spring of the 7th year, Evelyn planted a new rose bed in the Beckett garden. She had been planning it for 2 years, a deliberate expansion of her mother's rose collection, incorporating varieties she had sourced carefully from growers in San Antonio, and one extraordinary specimen she had found through a catalog. A deep red climbing rose from a nursery in Georgia that would, if it took to the Texas soil the way she believed it would, cover the south wall of the old Beckett house the way the jasmine did. She and Maria planted it on a warm April morning with Tommy's help for the heavy digging, and Eli came by at midday with a wagon that had lunch packed by the ranch cook, which was the kind of thing he did, the practical, thoughtful, showing up kind of love that she had understood as his particular language now for years. They sat in her mother's garden and ate and looked at the new rose bed, and at the old plants coming back around them, the irises Clara had carried from Tennessee surging up in their reliable April way, the lavender coming in thick and fragrant, the big cream roses on the fence posts opening their first blooms of the season. "She would have liked you," Evelyn said to Eli. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. "I would have liked her. She would have been very difficult to impress and then very thoroughly impressed. That was her way." "I understand that way," he said, which was both entirely true and the quietest possible self-portrait. Evelyn looked at her husband in her mother's garden in the April sun and thought about hard things becoming good things, about roots going deep enough to survive drought, about seeds carried in buckets of earth across enormous distances, about a cart on a dusty street and a leather pouch that felt like good news when it landed, about a man on a horse coming up a road in the evening light. She reached across and took his hand, and he looked at her, and in the look was everything that 7 years of marriage had built between them, the knowledge and the trust and the private history, and the 2 children running somewhere across the back of the property, arguing cheerfully about something, and the new rose bed, and the old irises, and the garden that had grown from one woman's love into something that kept providing long past the planting. "I want to expand the cart," she said. "Not just Dust Creek. I want to take it to the next town on the circuit days." He nodded, already thinking about it practically. "George knows a man who builds good wheels. The current axle has been asking for replacement anyway, and I want to train Maria properly, not just as a helper but as a real partner in the operation. That makes good sense. She has your eye for it." She looked at him. "You never once told me what to do with the business. It was never my business to tell, but you supported every decision. Every decision was yours to make. My job was to make sure you had what you needed to make them." She thought about this for a moment, about the particular quality of Eli Hunter's love, how it was never about control, never about diminishment, always about steady presence and material support and the complete genuine respect of someone who believed in what she was doing. "I want a 3rd child," she said. The directness of it surprised even her. He looked at her steadily. Something warm moved through his expression. "Do you?" "I do. A boy or a girl, I don't have a strong opinion. I just think this house and this land and this life are large enough for more." He was quiet for a moment in the way she knew now, the moment of full consideration. Then he said, "I agree." She leaned over and kissed him in the April garden, with the irises coming up around them, and the new roses going into the earth that had held 30 years of careful tending. And it felt like the most natural thing in the world and also like something extraordinary, the way all the most important things are both at once. Their 3rd child was born the following February, a boy they named Jacob, who arrived with his father's dark eyes and his grandmother Beckett's stubbornness already fully formed, and who from his very first week seemed to regard the world with a calm assessment that made old George Beaumont say, laughing, that another Eli Hunter had been produced, which Eli received with a straight-faced dignity that only made George laugh harder. The Hunter Ranch in the spring of 1890 was a place that had found its full nature. The cattle were excellent, the land managed with the same careful attention that had characterized the ranch under every generation of hunters. The Beckett garden produced its flowers in abundance, and Maria Garcia ran the expanded cart operation with an authority and skill that had made it a genuine business in its own right, stretching now to 3 towns on the circuit, with a reputation that had earned Evelyn a flattering inquiry from a merchant in Dallas. Thomas at 8 was the kind of boy who would have made any ranching family proud, serious, and capable, and kind in the particular way that comes from growing up around parents who treated kindness as a practical rather than a sentimental matter. Margaret at 6 was herself, fully and absolutely, and the ranch adapted around her as things tended to do. Jacob at 1 observed all of it with the thoughtful attention of someone gathering data. On a warm evening in May, Evelyn sat on the porch of the Hunter Ranch house with a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold, looking out at the land. The long Texas evening was doing its best work on the hills, turning everything that particular impossible gold, and the air smelled of grass and the distant cattle, and the wild roses that Eli had, without comment, planted along the fence line the spring after they were married. She heard him behind her, the familiar sound of him, and then he was in the other chair, and they sat for a while in the comfortable silence that was their oldest language. "I want to tell you something," Eli said. She looked at him. "All right." He was looking at the hills with the considering expression, but the considering expression was different than it used to be, warmer, more at ease, the expression of a man who has learned over years that looking outward doesn't require looking away from what you have. "I was afraid," he said, "when I was sending Tommy. I was afraid of coming to look at you myself because I thought—" He paused with the honesty that was so distinctively his. "I thought if I saw you and you were what I already suspected you were, it would require something of me. And I had spent 6 years after my mother died being very comfortable with requiring nothing of myself." She looked at him for a long moment in the golden evening. And then the fire happened, and I thought about you sitting behind an empty cart doing arithmetic about how much longer you could hold on, and I thought, I cannot sit here and buy your flowers in secret and let that be enough when it is clearly not enough." He looked at her. "I am glad I stopped sitting." She reached over and put her hand on his, and felt the warmth and the roughness of his palm, the same warmth and roughness she had felt the first night in the kitchen lamplight, unchanged by all the years. "So am I," she said. The sun went down over Comanche County in a long, glorious, extravagant Texas way, painting the hills in colors that had no names adequate to them, and the Hunter Ranch house behind them was warm and lit, and full of the particular sounds of their particular life. Margaret's decisive footsteps, Thomas reading to Jacob in the patient way he had, the distant voices of the ranch hands wrapping up the day's work, George Beaumont's laugh from the direction of the barn. Evelyn Beckett Hunter sat in the evening with her husband's hand warm in hers and thought about everything that had grown from a garden, not just the flowers and the business and the money that had paid off a dead woman's debt, but this life, this man, these children, this land. She thought about her mother on her knees in the earth with her Tennessee irises, believing in the invisible work of roots. She thought about a Tuesday in March when she had stood behind a cart full of flowers in a town that didn't seem to want them, and how the best thing that had come from that day had been something she hadn't planted and hadn't planned and hadn't seen coming, the mystery of a man who loved beautiful things enough to buy them in secret, and who had loved her well enough, eventually, to let her see his face. Everything she had carried had brought her here. She held his hand and watched the stars come out over Texas, and the night was warm and full and hers, and it was enough, and it was everything.